We now begin our first panel discussion of the day with our good friends Gilbarco Veeder-Root and their new entity KONECT. So if the panel could join us on stage, please. And the panel will start off first with Shankar delivering the panel keynote. Please do come up to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aid.
Thanks a lot.
I hadn't actually seen that video before, so Neil, good job. Well done. It's lovely to be here and excited to introduce this panel session. Before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm Shankar. I'm from Houston, Texas. Does anyone know what Houston's famous for? Oil, yeah, which is the exact opposite of this room, right? I graduated from the University of Texas, where the next EV summit's being held. I moved back to Houston. I started my career in oil. I spent the first part of my career figuring out how to pull oil out of the ground. I then went to work for Shell, and I figured out how to transport oil from the sea all the way to the refineries. I then moved to the refineries. I worked at refineries for a long time. Figured out some clever ways of refining oil better, and then I moved to Gilbarco Veeder-Root to complete my mission. Figuring out a way to pump oil from fuel dispensers in a clever way into your vehicles, or maybe not your vehicles, but other people's vehicles. I was at a dinner party a few years ago, and someone asked what I did, and my daughter spoke up, and she said, "Daddy's in oil." And I said, "Holy shit, what have I done?" Right? I worked with Gilbarco Veeder-Root, James, and a number of other people in this room to start a new business at Gilbarco Veeder-Root called KONECT, with the sole aspiration of helping our core customer base, fuel retailers, fleets, charge point operators, mobilize into that next generation of mobility. And that's exactly the aspiration of KONECT. When I took this business over a little over a year ago, I had never driven an EV car. I had no idea what that meant. So I live in London. I flew back to the States. I went to the car rental agency and I said, "Please give me whatever EV you have on the lot." They had one. They gave it to me. I grabbed the keys. I left the station. I left the depot, and it had 10% charge left. Okay. I took that car and I said, "Okay, well, actually, this is perfect. Let me go to a charging station. Let me figure out how this works, right?" So I went to. I don't want to. There's no one from Electrify America here or EVgo here, I hope. I went to an Electrify America station, and immediately there were 3 bays taken from Uber drivers. There was 1 bay open. I went to go charge, and it was dead. Where's that Echo Energetica guy? You'd be pissed. It was a payment issue. So it was. We own a company called Drives as well, right? And Drives, I went and did the reconciliation later, and we found out exactly what the problem was. I then left. I had about 15 miles left, and I went to an EVgo site. Three bays were taken. 1 was open. The charger was broken again, right? I had 4 miles left. I drove right back to the airport, gave the car back, and I asked, "Please give me your nearest ICE car, because I got to figure out how this works." That is a fundamental problem. I'm leading this business, and I can't figure out how to charge a damn car. And it is our vision collectively. It needs to be our vision to solve this problem, right? So I'm gonna quickly dance through some slides, but the emphasis of today's keynote or today's panel today is just that, right? What are we doing as an industry to solve what I believe is the biggest single issue in our industry, which is keeping these chargers alive and on to ultimately create that experience that consumers need to keep catalyzing further growth, right? So I'll click through for a second. This statement is not rocket science, but it is important. CPOs have a really hard job. There's many CPOs in here today. Toddington referenced it. Razor-thin margins in a consumer experience that's not perfect. And we, again, as an industry, have to work better together to catalyze that experience for consumers to help mobilize more. This problem is getting more difficult, all right? So the EV charging experience is getting further regulated by governments, and now everyone in this room will probably have heard of the UK's mandate to get to 99% uptime. That's insane, right? When I first saw that KPI, I said, there's no way, how do we do that, right? But again, working collectively as a room, we've got to figure out good ways of doing that, and hopefully the panel will give you a good lens of different strategies to make that happen today. If we think very quickly, if we think about how does this experience work for consumers when they find faults at these chargers, right? To double click on the topic. There are so many different players that exist in the ecosystem when these issues arise. A consumer calls a help desk from who knows where. That help desk tries to figure out the problem. That help desk then escalates to someone who's hopefully viewing and monitoring the chargers. Then maybe that help desk can triage and rectify that problem, but probably not. Then that problem gets escalated to a different charging OEM. Hopefully that charging OEM can diagnose that virtually. If not, they've got to triage and send field technicians to solve that. I was at a hotel yesterday. They had 2 EV chargers. Those 2 EV chargers had not worked in 4 months. There were Teslas parked right outside there. No power was going to those Teslas. I asked the hotel clerk what he was doing about it. He said, we can't figure it out. No one's coming to solve our problems. It's broken, guys. So I think this is, again, one of the reasons why we solved KONECT, or we created KONECT. Was our aspiration was to become a really end-to-end provider of not only the infrastructure, but the service as well. I don't want this to turn into a sales pitch. We can talk about this later. But the aspiration is to limit the amount of interfaces you have such that we can triage and diagnose and rectify problems as quickly as possible to get to that seemingly impossible 99% number. So with that said, how long did I take? I'm out. Oh. I am very pleased to introduce to you our esteemed panel members, Jarrod Birch from Shell Recharge and Charge UK, who's our policy lead, and then 4 members of the panel, Chris Pateman-Jones, he's the CEO of Connected KERB, Lewis Gardiner, Director of Operations for OSPREY Charging, and Elizabeth Warren, Director of Public Charging for Mayor in the UK, and then my good friend James Gale, who works on KONECT with me, who leads global operations for us. So with that said, I'd love to turn it over to Jarrod to lead us through this.
Thank you very much, Ohm, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I think Ohm did a really good job there of talking about why this is so important. We know that customers want this. It comes up time and time again as a really important topic for customers. But as Ohm also said, now we have regulators caring about it too, and that adds a whole new layer of complexity. So we've got our work cut out, as Ohm said, and I hope this esteemed group of people will help us to work out where we're going over the next 24 minutes. James, I wonder if I can give you the hospital pass to kick us off. Ohm has talked at a high level about the problems that we have. I wonder if you could just drill that next layer down and talk through some of the key challenges that are facing CPOs like the ones we have on the stage today.
Sure. Firstly, I won't get blinded by the blue light here. There's an immense glow kind of shining. I can see some of you in the distance. I think the true barometer for me here is actually my parents, randomly. I think the challenge I could see is the day my parents don't have anxiety about charging in the same way that they do about fueling a vehicle, I know the industry's won. I was thinking about using my kids as the analogy on this one, but I realized, one, it would probably scare me, my kids actually driving a vehicle, and 2, they could probably work things out because they're that way inclined. There are 2 key points that I picked actually out of yesterday's discussions. Number 1 was actually through from the pay-through team, where they were talking about payment should ultimately be invisible. And I think we can touch on that a little bit more. But there was a little bit more as well from the EY team, where they were talking about data, and that data should be shared and be available to all. So let's touch on the first point when we're talking about the payment experience being invisible. Well, I think charging should be invisible. It should be something that you don't even have to think about or worry about on the reliability stake. If we can get that right, then my parents won't have that anxiety. Now, the way in which I think that we can resolve that issue is by collectively as an industry sharing data amongst us. If I put that into kind of real world example, Om shared a great example. It's actually one of the examples I can remember picking up very early when I had early discussions with one of our CPO providers. Effectively, if we can, in the ideal world, have all the data being shared so that even from a charger side of things, we can have machine learning really understanding what the issues are going on inside the equipment, and it can fix itself. I mean, that's the utopia where you could get to, where the charger is automatically fixing itself because it knows the payment terminals in fault X, Y, Z, and it automatically resolves itself. Now, that may be some time off, but even in the interim, even the simple act of making sure that a call center operator, when a driver's got a problem, that they have got all the tools in front of them to be able to fix the problem, and they're not having to pass through many different people in that process to try and get that process as simple as possible. That's pretty much where I see it at the moment.
Absolutely. Maybe I could turn it over to you here, Lewis, as a CPO on the panel. Does that ring true for you? What are the kind of key challenges you pull out?
Yeah, I think, to what James said, the ecosystem is so complex. There's so many players. So you've got the CPO, who is almost the aggregator for so many elements. You've got the manufacturers, you've got the payment systems, you've got service partners. And when there's a fault on the charger, you know, you've got to triage that remotely, then send service partners to site. What you see remotely might be different to what you're then seeing on site with the engineer, how you manage that, how you get your spare parts in. And you know, there's only a certain amount that can be done remotely. So you know, take the customer service helpline. If there is an issue, you may actually have an issue with the charger that needs to be triaged, or the payment terminal maybe completely separately that needs to be triaged that is on a completely different system. So they're logging into two separate things. That's taking an extra 30 seconds, an extra minute. You've got the customer getting more and more irate. You know, I just want to charge. I just want to get the kilowatt hours in my car. And you know, to James's point, at the minute it is quite fragmented, and that is probably one of the biggest challenges. Is that manufacturers, CPOs, payment terminal providers, whoever they are, service partners, there is that disconnect at the minute, and there definitely could be a lot more collaboration to get the whole industry aligned. I mean, we're going to speak about the regulations as well, I'm sure, but you know, this shouldn't be just on the CPO. Everybody needs to be bought in to improve the uptime across networks.
Absolutely, and there's a tricky point here, isn't there, Liz, which is that the CPO is the face of the experience. The customer's getting irate, but it presumably makes CPOs quite irate as well when your charges are down.
Absolutely, and as a CPO, it's really important for us to have our chargers online. After all, that's how we make money, right? We're in this for the sustainability reasons that have been mentioned before, but ultimately we need to make a return on the investment that we've got from our shareholders and investors. So having those charge points offline is very frustrating. We spend a lot of time, effort, money trying to get them back online. The regulations are coming from absolutely the right place. We are all driven, pun intended, to make sure that we'd actually deliver a service that works for everybody. But in the words of earlier, that 99% is potentially a little bit insane. If we penalise the CPOs on this, when so much of it is out of our control, there's only really one net effect. It means we have to spend money to fix the problem. We have to spend money to get people to report on the problems, and ultimately that ends up in increasing costs for the customer.
Anyone that knows me will know that 6 minutes in to get to regulations is a new record time. I will pause for a moment on the regulations, just ask Chris to come in. Obviously, most of your infrastructure, Chris, is on street. You're working mainly with local authorities. That presumably brings challenges of its own. Does it bring any positives as well?
Yeah, on street and car parks predominantly. Well, maybe I'd start off with saying I don't think it's quite as bad as maybe we like to all talk about. I think also there are some, and I'm speaking as Connected KERB, not as Charge UK here, although I'm going to say something that I think Charge UK would support here, which is that most of the new infrastructure that's going in the ground today is extremely reliable. What we are dealing with is an asset base that has been just deployed over the last 15 years. And some of those assets are very, very old. And some of the contracts that we used to deploy those assets did not incentivize proper long-term maintenance. So a lot of the assets where we're seeing reliability issues are actually out of contract and very, very old. That doesn't get away from the fact there is a challenge from a PR perspective of the networks. And I think that's where data can be really, really, really important. I think for us as a network, when we're trying to look at a massive distributed base of assets across the entire of the UK, but not necessarily at high density at the moment, becomes very difficult to be maintaining those as efficient as you might be able to in, say, 5-10 years' time when the density is far, far greater. Where we've tried to focus, therefore, is in data and applying AI across the business. So we've deployed a tool that we've built called Sentinel, which now tries to track the network in real time. The reason why that's important is, and I think this is where maybe we should talk, and I think I'd encourage people to talk outside of the panel as well, on the importance of regulations and this arbitrary idea of a 95 or 95% target is less important than a customer having certainty or confidence more that when they turn up to a location, they're going to be able to find a charging point that works. That's why we deploy more than one charging point in each location. So if one is down, there will be others for you to be able to find. But equally, that's where data starts to become really important. So the problem with the regulations when you try and go for a 99% target is 99% is great, but really, if you're still turning up and you're in the 1% when it's not working, you don't care whether the network's been at 99% for the rest of the time. So I think more focusing again around that user experience and the expectation is far more important than arbitrary numbers.
So that was another mention of regulations. I'd suggest we move on to it now. And I don't know whether, Lewis, I can give you the short straw of giving just a 30-second rundown of what the regulations say, just to catch anybody up who's not as invested in it.
Yeah, so basically the framework that's been developed over the last 12, 18, 24 months basically looks to put all CPOs on a level playing field, so that if one CPO says they're at 99% uptime, it's the very same as another. And the main way to do that is looking at error codes and mapping them to an OCPI status. So when you have a specific error code that pops up on an EV charge point, the OCPI status then is the interface to customers, essentially. So when a customer turns up to a charge point or is looking at their mapping tool, wayfinding app, for example, that is the true status. So if the charge is in error and it can't actually deliver a charge, that should be accurately reflected in all the systems that are around it, where the customer interface is. And these regulations require significant reporting. That reporting is going to be audited by the government as well and enforced. So the government's going to be reviewing the reporting that CPOs are providing, which again aims to look to put all CPOs on a level playing field. So if one isn't reporting accurately, there will be potential financial enforcement or penalties involved there, or I think they're looking at putting in a risk-based enforcement policy as well. But yeah, it ultimately aims to give customers a true reflection of how that charge point, that single charge point, is operating.
Liz, maybe I could turn to you at this point. That was a really good explanation from Lewis about what the regulations aim to do. Could you share a view with us on whether we can expect, as of January 2026, when we'll start to get the first reports, are we as drivers going to see a more reliable network, or stay the same, or worse?
I'm already, as a CPO, heavily incentivized to have my charge points online and running. As I said earlier, it's how we make money, and we've got to report on that. We've got shareholders. Nothing's free, certainly anymore. I don't think we'll see, honestly, from my perspective, a massive increase in reliability because we're already doing everything we can to keep them online. I think what we'll actually see is, like I said, an increase in cost because all of that reporting is quite manual, it's quite difficult, there's some clarity we need around the reporting. I think that's fair to say, Lewis. And I think for that to take place, I've got to hire more people, I've got to spend more time doing that, and again, it increases the cost. We absolutely want 99% uptime as a CPO, but being penalised for it when not everything is under our control is very hard for us to manage. So, in short, no, I would hope that we're striving towards that with or without regulation. So I wouldn't see a massive change.
Which I think might be disappointing to hear from a driver's perspective, right? Because you know, Ohm talked about it briefly, but we know that customers expect more. Do you think people would be disappointed?
Chris and I probably have a view on this. I actually think it's a lot better than it was. I think we're suffering quite a significant amount from how the network was performing quite some time ago when those first when we went out and we asked the network and the customers what they wanted, and reliability was number one. We had a few CPOs that maybe weren't quite so reliable at the time. Things have changed, things have moved on. This network is changing rapidly, and regulation needs to change as rapidly as we are. As I said, we are massively incentivized to be online as much as possible, and that needs to be reflected. Chris, you've probably got a point here too as well, right?
Thank you. Well, just to, I think, reiterate what you've said, every shareholder who is invested into this market is probably more focused on uptime than any government regulation is. Because when you are not running a network that it can be accessed by people, you're not making any money. I think the point of being able to access is an important one to raise. I think this reliability topic is part of a bigger agenda on confidence in EV charging from users. The biggest complaint we have consistently coming through all of our call centres is not around the reliability of charging points. One, because the network performs pretty well. It's a relatively new network and it's designed to operate over a long period of time. But also because we put a number of charging points in every location, meaning if one is down, you can access the other ones. The key complaint we have coming through repeatedly, and this is the point around the broader context, is bay blocking. So and I think this is a really important topic for today when we're talking about Levi, is how we work with councils to make sure that when we are deploying, we make sure this is communicated properly to communities, and we ensure that rather than enforcement necessarily, which I think is a part of it, how we incentivise people to charge in the right way and how we incentivise people not to be blocking. Because it is consistently the biggest complaint we get coming through call centres. And to your point around CPOs being the ones who bear the brunt of this, we're getting the complaints around it, even though we can't necessarily influence it. I think there's another part which I think is a real positive to the point of there being ageing assets out there. Levi is going to, where I think you will see an improvement in the next couple of years, is what I understand from the Levi agenda that's out there is an awful lot of councils are going to be looking at the ageing assets they have and including them within the Levi tender process as a requirement that you either onboard them or you replace them. My concern on that as a CPO is being measured in the same way from a penalties perspective on a very, very old piece of kit. And then also being compared to your newer pieces of kit. So I think the opportunity to upgrade and replace those is going to be quite important.
And of course, the regulations we're talking about, the public chargement regulations, don't actually apply to chargers under 50 kilowatts. So you've got a slightly different regime. Maybe you could talk briefly to that, Chris. If you don't mind.
I think there's debate at the moment on it. And again, I would suggest that there is consistency and there's, I think, alignment that we all want to have as higher uptime as possible. I think whether 99% is in the same way that the contactless payments is a different scenario depending on the locations you're in. We're all, however, regardless of that situation, focused again on user access to charging points. That's the same goal. How you achieve it is maybe different. Where it ends, what the arbitrary number is, whether it's 95% or 99%, is less important than what's excluded. This is the very strange thing in the regulations at the moment, is we're talking about 99%. To meet 99%, you have to work out what you're going to exclude in order to allow you to meet 99%. It's an arbitrary process, and instead, actually, I think most of the CPOs are very focused on user journey instead. I think maybe my reflection in when I came 5 years ago here, my first time, most of the industry was run by very clever technical engineers who had built very clever technical solutions. I have noticed a real transition in the last 2 years to people who are much more focused on user journey and customer experience. There is a different set of people in the room today that are, and I think that there's just unfortunately a lag in terms of understanding and expectation within the public to what is the reality of the situation.
Thank you. We're coming up to the time for questions, so start thinking about them. I want to try and end on a positive note because we've done a little bit of complaining, not least me, with my questions. James, I wonder whether you could inject that positivity for us. We've talked there about complexity, about challenge, about the regulations. What are the causes for optimism as we look over the next sort of 3 to 5 years?
Sure. I think, one thing I'll kind of set the scene. I ran for Gilbarco Veeder-Root, its traditional fueling service business for many years beforehand. So I've got some good experience of kind of how to service fueling of vehicles on the traditional side of things. Now, one of the key differences between looking after an EV charging setup versus looking after traditional fueling is actually connectivity. And we have got that ability to be able to look deep into a charger remotely. Now, if I had that on the fuel forecourt days, I would have been extremely happy. if I looked at what we consciously tried to do, is we would, to try and maximize uptime for a customer, we would be talking to them on the phone to really understand and diagnose the issues on the gas pump and fix it for them there and then. If we look at our industry now in e-mobility, we don't need to do that. We have got the ability to be monitoring this equipment constantly and fix the issue even before a customer has that problem. And we're seeing that already across the board, but that's, if you kind of have the view that our traditional fueling business has managed to kind of get an experience that people are used to and people accept, we've got an industry ahead of us that's got even more opportunity that we can connect further going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Very positive. We're now at the point where we can take questions. So if you have one, please raise your hand. I think there's a gentleman here in a white shirt. Microphone will appear as if by magic.
Hi, Gary Piper, Bound McCann. We've spent the last 12 months just trying to work on entering into this market. We are a field service organisation that delivering all the things you talk about, but in a subtly different sector. 99% uptime is achievable with remote tools and all of those things. My question is to Lewis, who talked about collaboration. My experience of trying to get into the market over the last 12 months has been quite difficult. It is complicated. There are a whole host of different players operating quite often in silos. So I'm really excited to hear you talk about collaboration, because to be blunt, that would help us enter the market. And if we enter the market and able to engage, we will be able to help everybody deliver what you're looking for. But what does collaboration really mean, and how do you think that's doable when you're talking about private enterprise trying to do their own thing?
Good question. I think collaboration looks differently depending on how, what problem maybe you're trying to tackle. I think when I immediately think of some of the issues that we have, I think more collaboration between charger manufacturers, payment service providers, between CPOs and SIM providers. All chargers operate on SIMs, exactly like your mobile phones, but looking at maybe deploying charge points in rural areas. How do we do that when SIM connectivity is really poor? Bringing in your open reaches, your BTs, Skies, whoever it is, looking to bring services into those sites as well. Who's responsible for doing that? I think everybody is. I mean, it probably is the CPO. I know from our perspective, we're out there trying to work with loads of different industries and really coming at it from a perspective of why couldn't we achieve 99%? What are those problems? Is it connectivity? Is it charger hardware? Is it payments? And then trying to make the link with those other providers as well. So, I mean, it's not going to be an easy or a quick solution. And I think it will take time as the industry matures as well. So I don't think I've properly answered your question, because I think it is going to take a while. But I mean, I actually would be quite interested to have a chat with you afterwards as well.
I think Chris is interested in having some.
Just to say a bit of a positive, and I'll speak only from fast charging networks instead of those on street and car parks. Realistically, to date, I would say it has been subscale relative to the profit levels within the industry. So it's different from Rapids. You're looking across a large number of charging points, each making a very small amount of money per day, and with low utilization at the moment. You're going, and you don't have the infill, so it's distributed over a hugely large area. So a lot of operators have been not nickel and diming, but trying to do a lot of stuff internally. You're going to get to a transition point, I think, fairly quickly with Levi coming out, where you're going to see scale sort of reaching a point where you can start to outsource effectively, at a point where you don't need to do everything internally. So I think that's going to change fairly quickly with Levi, where you're going to get to a scale where the profitability and the size of the projects makes a bit more sense. There are only really today a few contracts that have been let, which are at a scale where you can work with external partners effectively.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there is a hand. There's a hand here on the third or fourth row.
Focus on things that you can control, because I know as an EV driver that when I go to use a charger, that's life. Sometimes it's going to be broken. But if you come back next week or next month and it's still broken, that's the kind of thing that more sets people.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things that's outside of our control at the moment as well that we're seeing is vandalism, cables being cut. When you turn up to a charge point and maybe the cable's being cut, that there's no specific error code for that. That is us seeing an error pop up and then having to send out a team or having the next customer call in to say cable's being cut. We would, in that instance, want to replace those cables as quickly as possible, and in many cases we could do it the next day. But there's another consideration perhaps we have to have in that circumstance is that just going to get cut the next day as well then? So, it's looking at what other things then do we need to do on that site, add CCTV, add more lighting, and trying to play a bit of a balancing act between how do we make sure that you can get your charge next time you turn up on that site versus how do we make sure we're not going to spend thousands of pounds over the next couple of weeks continually replacing those cables and then having them cut time and time again. But I'd say, yeah, that's probably one example.
Liz?
Just to add, it's quite irritating for us too when you can't go back and charge. And behind the scenes, you can't see it at the charger, but we are running around like crazy to make sure that those chargers get back online. So this isn't like the old days when maybe chargers could just be left when it was older kit. Now the pressure's on us. It really is on us to keep those chargers online and keep the revenue coming through. So we're doing everything we can in the background to make sure that we supply that energy to you.
Chris?
Yeah, I think to the point that you raised earlier on around the importance of data and the value of data on this, I think most of our customers, and for full clarity, so Martin works with me at Connected KERB, so, but I don't think most of our customers mind whether we're at 95% or 99%. What they care is when they turn up to a charging point, it's going to be working. And before that, what they want to know is if they're going to be directed to a charging point, it's working. There is no point in being directed to one that isn't. So to your point of what you control, you should control your customer journey. So we had a challenge across our network a few weeks ago where we had to replace an awful lot of component parts. And we did that from a safety perspective, which is, I know, something that we've been working with at Charge UK to make sure that penalties don't try and drive the wrong behaviours on safety attitudes. So we took a proactive step across that, and we communicated with all of our customers to tell them, to make sure that they knew when charging points were going to be going offline on that. We didn't have any negative, or we had very little negative feedback from customers, because generally people are pretty understanding if you communicate what's going on to them. What you don't want is to have complete radio silence where people turn up expecting to be able to charge, and then a already currently perceived stressful experience becomes extremely stressful, particularly in our place where I know motorway service station and en route charging is really important, but essentially our motto is that we do home charging for people who can't home charge. So you need to be completely reliable and be able to provide that sort of confidence to them, which again, maybe I didn't phrase that properly. You don't need to be completely reliable. You need to be able to provide people confidence that when they need to charge, they're going to be able to.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. And thank you all. We're going to close off now. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy your break.